Okay, everybody, can you hear me? Sounds like you can. All right, it's really my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. It's great to see a fantastic turnout here for the world premiere of Southern Range, Salmon in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Yeah. My name is Steve Lindley. I'm the director of the NOAA Fisheries Laboratory just up the street here, where we've been about 20 years and have built a strong collaboration with UC Santa Cruz on salmon science research and science communication over those 2 decades. And we're really pleased to partner with the Seymour Center, which is dedicated to educating people about the role scientific research plays in the understanding and conservation of the world's oceans. Hopefully you've had a chance to see all the great exhibits next door there about that. And also with UC Santa Cruz's Fisheries Collaborative Program, which is dedicated to advancing the science of fisheries ecology, fisheries resource management, and environmental research as related to marine and freshwater species and their habitats. Tonight's documentary film premiere is part of the FCP's and the Seymour Center's first ever Salmon Week. Hopefully you've been catching some of the events that have been going on there. This is one of a few things going on. Come back on Saturday. It's World Fish Migration Day. And there'll be a festival here. I think it starts around 10 o'clock. You can check on the Seymour Center website to get the exact details, but there's going to be food trucks, salmon scientists, and activities for kids like art and other things. It should be a great time, and I'll be there for that with a lot of my colleagues. Before we go any further, I do want to read UC Santa Cruz's land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Aswaswa-speaking Yupi tribe, the Amamutsan tribal band comprised of the descendants of the indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during the Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. So the film that we're about to watch depicts the plight of the southernmost populations of salmon in the world, and that plight is fairly dire. You're also going to meet some people working very hard to recover these salmon and prevent their extirpation. And reading this land acknowledgement really brought to mind a couple important connections, I think, that this movie, that you may find that it makes, which is the value of traditional stewardship practices that the people indigenous to this area developed that allowed them to live with salmon productively for millennia. The historical trauma that's also mentioned in that acknowledgement is closely related to the almost 2-century-long decline in Pacific salmon. And for much of the 200 years or so that salmon have been declining, people have been working fairly hard, but with limited success, to reverse those declines. I hope this film causes you to reflect on our relation to salmon, the land and the waters upon which they depend, and our relationship with those lands and waters, because it's really our relationships that are going to need to change for us to achieve salmon recovery. So after the film, there'll be a panel discussion. You may have sat down on a pencil. I hope you didn't impale yourself on that. You can write your questions on the little cards and raise those in the air. Someone will come around to collect those questions. If you're online, you can enter questions in the chat feature, or it's I guess a Q&A feature, and the panel will try to answer those as time permits. There's also closed captioning available, which you can turn on at the bottom of your screen. So finally, please silence your cell phones and enjoy the documentary. Thank you.
I was talking to a friend the other day about how few salmon I've seen in the watershed this season. They told me, when a species is hanging on by a thread and so hard to come by, we're almost forced to imagine them. On the central coast of California, once robust populations of coho salmon and steelhead are now listed as threatened and endangered. Coho are even said to be functionally extinct in coastal watersheds south of the Golden Gate. Here on the unceded lands of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe in present-day Santa Cruz County, salmon have lived alongside wildfire, drought, landslides, and floods for millennia. But as climate change renders disturbances all the more frequent, salmon rely increasingly on human efforts to keep their species afloat. The CZU Lightning Complex fires of 2020 burned through the Scott Creek watershed, further entangling the fate of these salmon with us. So how do the otherwise normal relationships between salmon and fire change for a species seemingly on life support? And how, in the midst of climate crisis, can we create a better home for salmon here on the Central Coast?
This was truly a team effort, a collaborative effort. But tonight we're going to hear from three folks who, in my mind, represent art, science, and action, and how this film brings those three things together, and the power of bringing art and science and action together in a place like this, and with a community of people like you. So first, allow me to introduce, here we go, to Lisa Lurie. Come on up, Lisa. Lisa is the executive director of the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, who also read the second letter to salmon in the film that you just saw. And prior to joining the RCD, she managed agricultural water quality programs for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary and has worked on watersheds around, quite literally around the world. Lisa also has a master's of environmental management from Duke University. Thanks, Lisa, for being with us tonight. I'd like to also introduce you to the science pillar of tonight's panel. This is Dr. Eric Palkovacs. Eric did appear in the film, and he is a co-producer and also the lead scientist on this film. He's a professor here at the UC Santa Cruz in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, the Associate Director of Research Initiatives in the Institute of Marine Sciences, and Director of the Fisheries Collaborative Program. And his research focuses on the ecology of freshwater and coastal ecosystems and applications to conservation and fisheries management. So super relevant to this discussion today. Welcome, Eric. And finally, the creator, the artist, the person who wrote and directed this film, Kyle Baker. A UC Santa Cruz grad in 2020, Kyle got his Master's of Fine Arts in Social Documentation right up on main campus. And his work has been shown, get this, at the International Documentary Film Festival, Santa Barbara International Film Festival, San Francisco Independent Short Film Festival, Smithsonian Mother Tongue Film Festival, and community screenings worldwide. So thank you, Kyle, so much. Thank you. And I mentioned at the beginning, this is a cool opportunity to bring together art and science and action, and the three of you represent, in many ways, those three pillars of this film, and those three pillars of making a difference, as many folks in the film talked about. So I want to spend a few minutes unpacking these three things and how they connect with each other. So Kyle, I'll actually start with you on this one. You were a fellow of Salmon Nation and have worked on other salmon conservation films, including with indigenous tribes from the Pacific Northwest. What is the role that art and artists play in protecting salmon here in Santa Cruz and more broadly?
Yeah, well, I think I would want to start in thinking about my other work in acknowledging that there aren't any indigenous people in this film or in this version of this film. And I think about my work not as comprehensive or necessarily as finished, but I don't really think about salmon or salmon restoration work, especially in the context of climate change, like we're seeing here, without thinking about colonialism and without thinking about indigenous practices. Members of the Alma-Matin tribal band who were mentioned in the land acknowledgement were a part of the conversation for this film. Scheduling conflicts happened and they just didn't help out for innocent reasons. But I think in thinking about what role art plays in this kind of work, I have to think about my own process and kind of go back to the drawing board, because the tribe has filmmakers approaching them all the time, actually, not just me, with their own ideas and with their own projects. And they seem perfectly happy to help out, but they've also explicitly expressed that they want to be leading projects too. So that gives me pause, and I think that should give all of us pause, whether in art or science or community work, to listen. And I try to think about my practice as one of listening. You know, on that note, I think 3 things to mention in the talks we were involved with the Alma-Matin tribal band and work they're doing around salmon, which I think is sort of my duty as an artist to sort of communicate that. And I'm not an expert on what they're doing necessarily, but 3 things they expressed that I think are worth mentioning and that people here might be interested in learning more about is fire management, which is a huge topic, obviously, on the West Coast and in sort of the American West. Chairman Val Lopez expressed a lot of direct connection between resource management and fire management, and how it's restorative to streams in direct relation with salmon. The second is salmon as a first food. Down here, we have so little salmon that it's, you know, I'm just learning that there are salmon in Santa Cruz, like hopefully some of you are learning tonight. And there are so few of them that, you know, it's hard not to focus on restoration efforts alone, but they were a food source to people, a really important one. So Lisa Carrier from the Alma-Matin tribe expressed pretty beautifully the connection between first foods and first foods, salmon in this case, that they want to reestablish for cultural healing as well as physiological healing, a real dietary element of indigenous life. And the third, sorry, I'm totally derailing your question here. The third, but it's important, I think it's connected. The third is the science that the tribe is actually doing. And they're doing some really cutting edge eDNA collection to kind of reestablish the historic range of coho salmon in direct relation to their people's fishing and gathering practices. So that's how I would sort of put my answer to your art question into an active sentence.
Thanks, Kyle.
That was one sentence.
So Eric, you know, early in the film, Rosalia is walking through the creek and she talks about the future of salmon. She discusses her hope for the recovery, and she puts it less in the science sense of this many numbers in these places. I hope to see them in every riffle pool transition doing their thing. So you've been in science a long time. Do you relate to that statement and that sentiment? What does that mean to you as a scientist hearing Rosalia say that?
Yeah, I think most scientists probably do relate very well to that. When I think about the scientific measures we use to monitor the health of a population, you can sort of think of that as like when you go see the doctor, right? They take your blood pressure, they take your vital signs. That is not your health, right? Those are indicators of your health. And the scientific information we collect are indicators of population health and indicators of ecosystem health. They're not health itself. And so if we think about it in this way, where we sort of think about the science as we're taking the vital signs of the population, we're taking the vital signs of the ecosystem, but what we're really trying to do is characterize, do we have a healthy ecosystem? And a healthy ecosystem is not a static entity. It's resilient. It can, come back from challenges. And so I think that, Leah's comment about, wanting to see the salmon spawning and just doing their thing, and the ecosystem being its sort of resilient self is something that I think most scientists are also striving for. And the lens that we get to look through is the lens of the data that we collect.
So Lisa, you're hearing an artist, you're hearing a scientist. You know, it occurred to me watching you read your letter that that was a cool moment of vulnerability that I think we rarely see from sort of civic and government leaders. It was pretty special to see, and it gave me hope that there are some deeply passionate people behind the wheel for some of these things. And now having seen this film, heard Eric comment, heard Kyle comment, how does art and science factor into decisions that are being made at these higher levels?
Well, first I'd say just the process of making this film and that challenge of writing a letter to Salmon was a really beautiful experience. I mean, for me, it gave me this permission to pause and step back and think about the why of the work that we do. And thinking about these three pillars of art and science and action, I think about the science really informing the what is happening in the world around us, helping us understand through a particular lens, what are we seeing, what are we experiencing? And the work that we do as conservation practitioners is really focused on the how do we engage our community? How do we change our behavior? How do we modify the way that we live in the world to be moving the dial in a positive direction and all of that? And then stepping back and thinking about a letter to the world around us and the artistic expression, the storytelling, it was really the why, you know, what motivates people and what's that deeper connection? And I feel like on some level, I mean, we can all relate to that. And it's been interesting kind of this theme of Indigenous knowledge, and part of what I thought about in reflecting in that idea of how do we restore our relationships with the world around us was really kind of illuminated by Dr. Robin Kimmerer. If you've read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. She's an ethnobotanist, an ecologist, professor, a storyteller, and she integrates her ancestral and ecological knowledge in everything she does. And that theme of restoring relationships is something that I really, in reading her work and experiencing her art in that way, it was like putting a finger on the thing that I knew was missing but couldn't quite identify. And I think that's the power of art and really helping to kind of express and communicate the data, the work, the relationships in a way that's really moving and that kind of gets at that fundamental motivation. It was funny, I was talking with one of our Watershed stewards today about, what do you think about art and science? And she responded saying, data visualization is art. And I was just like, yes, data visualization is art. And in the same way that, you know, the dancers who were going out doing choreography in the CZU burn zone after the fire, you know, to really like express that connection, and all of the, you know, the animation that we see in this film, there's so many different ways we can be tapping into the more kind of fundamental motivators and spirits that ultimately that's what drives conservation and really a more holistic way of living in the world.
And I think just on thinking about like interdisciplinary practice like this, I don't think art is any bigger or more important or can contain the others better. Actually, at the start of making this film, I emailed Donna Haraway, who's a local author, an amazing thinker, and she respectfully declined. But then she told me to go check out this project called Feral Atlas, which is also sort of had a local genesis here. And Feral Atlas is all about, really at its core, an interdisciplinary multimedia web project that brings really hard scientific papers and journalism and filmmaking and painting and animation into this whole interactive world. specifically to open up points of departure from those specific fields, right? Think about things in new ways and give ourselves new problems to solve and new ways of thinking. So that was sort of inspirational in the beginning of this project for me too. So I think I'm on the same page with you there.
Yeah. And people don't generally stand up and clap after a scientific paper, but a beautifully produced film has an emotional effect that a column of data doesn't necessarily have.
Just add some music. You know,
I heard it once described as, art can be a side door into accessing conversations or ideas or challenges that you may not be able to face head on in your own head. So I think this has been a beautiful application of that in many ways. Let's shift gears a little bit and let's dig into each of these different pieces, and let's move and talk about the science of it, Eric. So I'm looking at you, but we'll bounce around a little bit. Can you provide any updates on the research project that you highlighted in the film? Are there any other findings about these impacts of mercury and other heavy metals on their sense of smell?
Yep, I have to start by making a plug for a poster that you can come check out at World Fish Migration Day Festival on Saturday. So we have some results from the mercury analysis of the fish we've been collecting, and we do see elevated mercury levels in the San Lorenzo watershed and the Pescadero watershed that are sort of alarming. And we're not entirely sure at this point how connected that is to the fire itself, but we do see elevated levels that suggest that there is mercury in the watershed that's making its way to juvenile fish. We're in the process of looking at the behavior of the fish to see if that seems to be impaired by elevated mercury levels. And sort of, we haven't really fully, this is sort of the general science answer, right? We haven't fully analyzed the data yet. But we do have suggestive evidence that mercury is changing. The fish with higher mercury levels are not responding to environmental cues the same way that the normal fish that don't have high elevated mercury levels are. And that's sort of concerning if you think about things like natal imprinting, which we talked about in the film, right? They need to be able to smell their home watershed in order to make their way back to their home watershed. And if they can't do that effectively, then they may not be able to make it back to spawn. So preliminarily, we can say we do see some elevated mercury levels, and we have some preliminary evidence that may be having some harmful effects.
Climate change was either directly mentioned or alluded to several times throughout this film. And actually we're getting a couple of questions from the audience about climate change, both in the room and online. So thanks everybody for your questions. Let me put it this way. As these impacts of climate change and human impacts are becoming more severe, what do those changing conditions mean for our local salmon? Where's this headed? Lisa or Eric or Kyle, if you've pulled out any insights there.
Sure. Well, I mean, a few things to think about in terms of the impacts of climate change that we're seeing today, in real time, is looking at drought and stream flow. I mean, it's a critical situation in a lot of our streams. And in terms of what salmon need for a healthy existence to be able to pass through our streams, right? And the greater impact we see on our decreasing flows, the more that a barrier that might have been less of a concern under higher flow situations suddenly becomes more impassable and becomes a bigger concern. Similarly, as we've experienced, we see the impacts on our vegetation and on the intensity and the risk of these catastrophic wildfires. And so it's that change in the intensity and in the likelihood that leads to greater vulnerabilities, and where our landscape and our watersheds are adapted to disturbance. Disturbance is a good thing. When we're seeing these extreme events as a result of the impacts from climate change, suddenly what could be a positive disturbance on the landscape, it becomes game changing.
Especially when you have a single isolated population that's sort of hanging on by a thread and needs so much human intervention to even continue to hang on by a thread. A thing like a fire that, destroys, if you're talking about thinking about the hatchery and all the effort that goes into keeping this population going, it's like, I think of it as like a patient in an ICU, right? It's like patient on life support, and any disturbance, any change to that system could be the one thing that sends it in the wrong direction. And when we think about creating resilient populations, I think it's really critically important for us to think about bringing these fish back to multiple watersheds. And that theme comes out in the film a little bit, which is multiple watersheds give us sort of, different, the eggs are spread in multiple baskets, right? So if we lose one watershed, we have some fish in another watershed that creates this sort of buffering capacity within the system. So that's really what I think we need to be restoring, is the resilience of the system in restoring fish across multiple watersheds. So we're not so entirely reliant on just a single system.
Yeah, and I think thinking about the question of what does climate change mean for us? It could mean, like, the film ends with a fact that I learned late in the film process, where a record number of coho were actually monitored in the watershed, and all of my salmon, I'll call it research, but it's not all my salmon research, it has been in the Northwest, where, and thinking about Alaska and Washington State and Oregon, climate change doesn't always mean decimation of populations. It could mean extreme bursts and blooms, right? So you get a really good year and we celebrate because we want to celebrate, but then the next year, fish populations can plummet. So here, even though you can't help but be hopeful that there's a lot of salmon in the watershed, I think that's sort of a thing. I think climate change should force us to think much longer term than we've had the capacity to in the last however many centuries.
And with those sort of year by year variations in mind, we got a question from the audience here. Do we know why they came back in record numbers in 2022 after the CZU fire, or is it too early to know?
I don't know. Maybe Steve Lindley knows the answer to this question. I'm not sure why presumably a combination of a strong cohort, right, that year that left the stream, and then good survival in the ocean for that cohort of fish. And, I think this theme of variability is a really important one, because our climate's becoming more variable, and that variability is going to be reflected in the numbers of fish that return from one year to the next. So, that has been an important theme in climate change work, is that, we're getting more variable conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to be prepared to manage manage our systems against a backdrop of a more highly variable climate.
And when we have fewer and fewer rain events, but more extreme, larger rain events, it really matters when those rain events come and in what quantity. And so I think a lot of the variation we see is also dependent on those year-to-year variations on when is the precipitation coming relative to when the fish need it.
Right. And Lisa, can you maybe give an example of how the timing of the rain might impact the situation we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, there might be folks in the audience better equipped to do that, but thinking about the timing of when fish are looking to make their transit to the ocean and return, thinking about when our lagoons are breaching and closed, and precipitation playing a part in all that time.
A moment ago, Eric talked about this variability and needing to take that into account as we make decisions about our resources. Is that showing up at the RCD right now in the conversations you're having locally or statewide, or whomever you're speaking with, or are these conversations happening? And if so, what decisions are you making on that?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your question.
Yeah, no, Eric, that's fine. Eric talked about, and Kyle as well, because we're looking at such a long-term situation with climate change, we may not be able to get too hopeful about a single year, right? And Eric referenced a moment ago, hey, we might be seeing these greater variabilities year to year. And I wonder if the RCD or other decision makers are thinking about that, and if so, how it shows up in decisions.
Certainly. I mean, I think in any decision making, you're choosing where to put your effort, where to put your resources. And I think we definitely have to be taking into consideration what are the long-term projections for this species, and what are the long-term needs, and what can we be doing today to set up the system for success. And for, I think, Brianna, in your letter, that creating that home, that welcoming home, and a lot of that is thinking long-term, right? A particular example that I think is worth like celebrating is thinking about in the lower Scotts Creek watershed, where the pan out at the closing scene was perfect, because you see this bucolic watershed, and you pan out and you see the Highway 1 bridge spanning across the lagoon there, and you think back to what did that system look like in the 1920s, before Highway 1 was constructed. And you think of the impact that infrastructure, by its mere existence, has on that entire system. And we have right now in this community such an amazing collaboration happening between leaders of these agencies who have a role to play in these decisions. We've got the Resource Conservation District, we have Caltrans, we have the Regional Transportation Commission, we have the landowners at that site, Cal Poly Swanton County Parks with the beach there, coming together with all of the resource agencies, federal, state, local, all of the scientists, to really look at how can we be thinking about restoring this system and planning for our infrastructure in a way that it changes the whole way of thinking from, okay, let's do what we need to do to meet our human needs, figure out our impacts and mitigate those impacts. And flipping that on its head, and instead thinking about, let's work to really understand what the system needs in the long term, given what's it going to take to restore this ecosystem. And then let's design our infrastructure around that. And so through this collaboration, people are coming together to think about, how do we replace a bridge to meet a human need with transportation infrastructure that in and of itself is vulnerable to climate change, and modify that in a way that we're also restoring critical habitat for coho, for steelhead, tidewater goby, the list goes on. And not only have this opportunity to make this real lasting change here, but to model a collaboration that could be replicated across the coast. I mean, you just look up and down the coast of California, every bridge, every stream faces this similar dynamic. And I think it's really encouraging that people are coming together and taking the time to really do that shift in thinking, and gives me a lot of hope for where we're headed, and how we might in the future be thinking that way from the very beginning, as opposed to trying to
fix a
problem. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are getting, that's a perfect segue. We're getting a lot of questions about action and kind of what we can all do to help. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that side of things. So for you, Lisa, this is a question coming in hot. I'm watching the cursor move as I'm reading this. Can you discuss the impacts of continued human population growth and development in relation to planning recovery actions for salmon?
Well, I mean, when we think about human population growth, it really comes at understanding and managing our strain on those same natural resources that salmon and other species need to thrive. So key among them, right, being water, number one. So as we grow, as our community grows, our demand on water continues. And so I think that really then plays into our planning for, okay, how do we then accommodate and how do we build better and more efficiently and modify our behavior so that we can meet the needs of our growing community and at the same time reduce or at least stabilize our demand upon water. Thinking about how are we in our, achieving our conservation and reducing our demands. Similarly, thinking about just footprint on the landscape. And I think our community has been really, a leader in terms of preserving land and thinking about open space and maintaining the existence of wild spaces within our county. And I think that's something that as we continue moving forward is always going to be at the forefront of making sure that we're balancing and being mindful of what is our footprint on the landscape and how does that impact the other life around us.
I think the education piece is really big here too, is that's one of the reasons that motivated, FCP and Seymour Center to do Salmon Week, is to get the word out about these iconic species that are here and that need our continued help. And as a faculty member, I really love the fact that Kyle put some footage of the freshwater ecology class in the film, because I really think that part of my job is really important and inspiring in terms of teaching my students how to use scientific tools to achieve these conservation objectives. And so, that's one of the things that keeps me passionate about my job is, teaching students and watching them, watching their passion for learning about how science is done really sort of, start to develop. And the film was a great experience because sort of took it the next step too, and showed this is not just science for the sake of science, but science for the sake of conserving these really important species. And that, oh my gosh, there's even a guy who's like gonna take some film of this, which must be pretty important, right? If there's a guy who's gonna follow us around with a video camera. So that was a pretty fun experience.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that jumped out to me about this film is it just was incredibly clear that there are deep relationships that are formed between people and nature and salmon, the whole system. And this is a question that came through the audience too, and the question reads, it's clear by seeing folks talk about how they relate to salmon that why they're doing the work is relational. So based on exposure to the species, nostalgia, and identity building. So how do we promote this relationship building with a now rare species in this community?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably different for everybody. And I think, like, for me, if I were to answer myself, I think making a film is a path to building friendships and relationships, multi-species. So it's a way to sort of commit, an art project or a scientific project or an initiative through the RCD, in Lisa's case, can be a way to build compassion, a way to build relationships and think about care, multi-species care. And one thing I think about, and we've talked about plenty of times, is iconography. And even in the Bay Area and Marin County, where salmon are a little bit more prevalent, I would say, you cross a salmon stream and you'll see a plaque. You'll see a statue of a salmon and a sign, an informational sign. And while they're sort of scattered around Santa Cruz County and elsewhere, there's sort of a severe lack of iconography, I would say, especially because of how dire straits these salmon are. So on Mission Street, there's a giant salmon. There might be another little tile of a salmon somewhere, and at Junction Park, I think it's called, there's a big cement thing. But yeah, I would say community art projects would be a huge way to sort of raise awareness at the very least.
For every sea otter that we see, we need a salmon.
with salmon. Yeah.
Another way to put this, and just for Eric and Lisa in particular, if you want to expand, a question from the audience was, how can we ensure the importance of salmon and these restoration efforts to someone who doesn't seem to care? It was related to the question I think we just discussed, but Lisa or Eric, if you want to build on anything Kyle just shared. How do we talk about salmon from your perspective in a way that someone who may not be connected will be able to hear?
Well, there's so much work to be done in terms of communicating and telling the story. And I feel like, I guess the question kind of gets me back to thinking about what at our core as human beings like drives us. And of course, everyone's unique. But I think as what I've experienced in kind of the conservation practitioner type of space is that we have this tendency to want to assign the economic value to the species. And there's a lot of reason and utility for that. And I think those messages are received by certain audiences. But there's the deeper why, which is a lot of what we've been talking about here, of like, how can we communicate the importance of salmon in a way that is less about what I gain from them personally and more about appreciating their intrinsic value? I think making that case to someone who's perceived as not caring is maybe thought as coming up a brick wall. But I don't know, I guess maybe I would challenge that assumption. Like, fundamentally, does someone truly not care? Or is it just not finding, meeting people where they are? And I think so much of what we do in our work is trying to understand our partners, what's their motivation, what's their needs. And I think the same way that we try to meet people where they are in any project we do, we also need to be thinking about meeting people where they are in terms of how can I overcome any barrier to receiving this information. And part of it, is what you were saying in the beginning, is like so much of it is listening too. And I think that's, we need to be thinking about that too.
Yeah. And different people probably have different ways of being connected with. And I mean, that was one of the things we thought about a lot when we put together Salmon Week, is a variety of different activities and a variety of different events that appeal to different kinds of people with different kinds of motivation. So we have Science Sunday talks. We have, the awesome documentary we just saw, and we have a new exhibit in the Seymour Center exhibit hall, and we have a festival. And so, that's it's sort of a menu of different kinds of options. And I think that that's important because not everybody is going to have the same motivation, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't care for different reasons, or be reachable via different sort of means.
Well, these are these softer actions. So let's move into some concrete actions here. And so the most common question I'm seeing here pop up, thanks everybody who's submitting questions. The most common question I have here is about action, right? What can we do? So I'm going to summarize all of these questions that I'm seeing in one simple way. And Lisa, I'm going to start with you and give each of you a chance to respond to this. But if you could mobilize everyone who lived in Santa Cruz County to do one thing to protect salmon, what would you encourage them to do? And Lisa, you can start.
Well, it's hard to put a finger on one thing, but I would say starting with, at the very least, understanding where your water comes from. Getting that information and then thinking about it. Thinking about what it means if your water is coming from San Lorenzo River, if it's coming from one of our groundwater aquifers, and really making that connection between where your water is coming from, what else is dependent upon that water, and from that, then thinking about your use of that water and how you might be able to just step one is being conscious of that use and being conscious of where it's coming from. And from there, I think action rolls. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Eric.
Yeah, I would say sort of along the theme of more knowledge inspiring action would be, I would think get out into nature and hike along one of these streams and spend some time out there. And I think that would inspire people to care. And then I think the second thing would be to just insist that people not accept the way things are as the way things have to be, that we can make choices that can change the trajectory of where we are. And I think people have to feel empowered to be able to do that. And I think part of what I love about the film is that it ends on a hopeful note and says, we can change this, right? We can change this. And I really truly believe we can change this, that we can have salmon strong back in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We have to make the decision to do that, though. And it's going to take commitment. It's going to take financial resources. It's going to take people all working together. But I do think that can happen, and we can have it back as long as we dedicate ourselves to that goal.
I think everyone in Santa Cruz County needs to get a tattoo of a salmon. I'm like sort of joking, but I'm sort of not. I was like, where
Forehead.
Your choice. Yeah, I mean, it's such obviously a hard question to ask, and we obviously can't think just about salmon, right? You named a bunch of other tinier species, and there's a lot of other species. And I guess the way I think about it is just how to commit ourselves to a species or a place or a stream or whatever that we care about, right? And everyone has their own way of doing that. And I think this is why the three of us are up here talking about our respective pillars of this. Yeah, I don't know. So getting a tattoo seems sort of like the most material thing I could think of. Like, I mean, we could get the biggest group tattoo in history right now. Some of you probably have salmon tattoos already.
Raise your hand if you have a salmon tattoo. Yeah, we got one in the back.
Yeah, so I don't know whether it's an art project or a research project, or you're volunteering, or you've never seen a salmon before and you're sort of curious. Just like go find them and look at them. Yeah, right. That's all I'll say about that.
Great. Well, we're gonna just do one and a half last questions here, Kyle, and this will be for you. What happened to the piece of paper that Matt put in the creek?
That's probably my girlfriend's question, because she told me to keep in the part of the footage that we had when I ran after the piece of paper. So we had a beautiful frame, and my stupid boot ran into the frame because we agreed, Matt was nice enough to print it on eco paper. So even if it went, it was fine. But we retrieved the piece of paper and we have footage to prove it.
That'll be in the B cut reel we'll share with you afterwards. No, but Kyle, you're a prolific documentarian, and you've done a number of projects documenting work like this. And from an artist perspective, and this is a question from the audience, what do you see as the progress that's being made currently in the world of conservation, and what do you hope to see? Where do you hope to see this end from an artist perspective?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's really, I was being serious when I think I said this at the beginning, that, a film, maybe we were talking between ourselves actually, but a film is not an ending thing. It's like, it feels like a culmination of things, but there's so much work that wasn't featured in here. And there's so much work, I thought of a million different ways to re-edit this while we were watching. So, I think I think, yeah, it's hard to put a finger on, I guess. Yeah, it left me speechless. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo Kyle's theme about the process being really important, and the process of Kyle brought a lot of people together that all work in the same area but don't necessarily interact with one another all the time. And I think the process of Kyle bringing this group of people together was really important, right? I think that was really a key contribution of the film. So we have the beautiful end product, but the process was really important in and of itself.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's still sort of yielding results. Like tomorrow you're taking people out to the hatchery and the fish trap that are featured in the film. So people are taking a field trip because of this film. Not to pat my film on the back, but it's one art project that can do this, so it's like.
So I think I just heard a call to action to all of you in the room and online to share this film and to share this work, to mobilize our community to understand salmon, to connect with salmon, and to take action in a variety of ways. I want to thank Lisa Lurie, Eric Palkovacs, and most of all, Kyle Baker for an amazing, amazing evening. Thank you so much.
All the people who are in the film too.
Let me leave you with this. Seymour Center, we're trying to do more of this. We're trying to do more of connecting the science happening at the UC Santa Cruz with the real issues, environmental, coastal, marine issues that are most relevant to this community right now and into the near term. We're going to be doing more projects like this. And I want to hear from you. What are the topics, the issues that you're most passionate about, so that we can produce more films, ideally with Kyle, so that we can put together great exhibits and events that are really relevant to this community, so we can mobilize support for the science that's happening, for the civic work that's happening, for the boots on the ground organizations like Coastal Watershed Council, who's sitting in the back, Watsonville Wetlands Watch, Regeneracion, the Monterey Bay Salmon and Trout Project, many of whom are in the room tonight. My call to action to you is to support these organizations who are doing the boots on the ground work, support independent filmmakers and artists like Kyle, many of whom who live in our community, because this is, as we've heard tonight, it's the combination of these three things that's really going to move the needle for our community and for species like salmon. Thank you so much for coming tonight, folks. Have a great evening.